Thank you for coming. I appreciate you being here. My talk, I planned for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then I plan for the remainder of the hour to take questions. So if it serves you, I really invite you to jot down some questions, pen and paper, on your laptop, whatever serves you. So first, I want to start off by sort of saying, answering the question I put to myself, why me? Why am I giving this talk? Because if you read the flyer, you understand that I've been a filmmaker of some 45 years now, reasonably successful, most known for the film Hoop Dreams, and increasingly also giving public talks, writing books and blogs, and doing other things. But I'm not a PhD, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, I'm not a scholar, a medical doctor, a psychologist, a philosopher, a professional advisor, or some kind of guru, okay? So my lifelong career has been about art, and I'm really an artist by trade. So, and I'm a storyteller. So I tell stories primarily through films, occasionally through song, but increasingly through writing blogs and books. But I have been initiated by life. And I've always been a very close observer of my own life and other lives. Like Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher, I recently read a wonderful book about him called How to Live. And it's full of, I think, choice nuggets that can be applied to this particular time. So it's funny that after all these years, I found myself to be a kind of an unrecognized disciple of Montaigne. But I have practiced and studied rites of passage now for about 20 years. I've made a number of films about it. I founded an international nonprofit devoted to teen rites of passage called Youth Passageways back in 2015. And now I have a brand new book out called Rites to a Good Life, Everyday Rituals of Healing and Transformation. And basically the design of the book is to be a companion piece to the long form Rites of Passage documentary that I'm going to probably finish next year. We've already finished an 11.5-minute short film on the same subject, which is available on my website, warriorfilms.org. Just click on the Rites of Passage tab, and you'll be taken right there. So, you know, it'll be, that book will be, I think, a good companion piece to the film. And it's already available in digital form. You can get it on Amazon through a search for my name or Rites to a Good Life. And we'll have hard copies and audio versions available by year's end. So most of what I'll actually be talking about today is already in my 3-part blog, which I published back in May on my Warrior Films website, and it's called Welcome to Our Planetary Rite of Passage. So Arnold van Gennep was the first person to coin the term Rite of Passage, and he did it in his 1909 book of the same name. Van Gennep was a Dutch cross-cultural anthropologist, and what he had done was he looked at indigenous people's practices of initiation around the world. And he basically devised, sort of boiled down what were the most common elements of all of these different rites of passage. And by the way, let me say that I use rites of passage and initiation as synonyms. To me, they're really interchangeable terms. So you'll hear me repeat them both many times in the course of this talk. Now, to define rite of passage most simply, I would just call it an intentional transformational shift from one phase of life to another. So Van Gennep determined that there are basically 3 main stages of rite of passage: separation, ordeal, and return. And I want to look at each of them now in a lot more detail. So separation, which is also sometimes called severance, is all about letting go and severing from all of our attachment to traditional ways of being. And this is a common feature, again, all of these things are, of initiations for people regardless of age. Although I have been most focused on a lot of my work through the years on that transition from late adolescence to young adulthood. How do teens transform from being adolescents to being actually truly mature young adults? So the first phase of this severance, you have to be separated from all the objects that you hold most dear. And today, that of course would mean cell phones, house and car keys, money, credit cards, IDs, billfolds, photos, even clothes, timepieces and wedding rings. All of those treasured physical belongings, those objects that we use in our daily lives to establish identity. All of those things that we have that signal to the world, to other people, that I am me. This is Frederick Marx. So it's not only the objects that have to be severed, but it's also all the patterns of everyday behavior. They have to be completely disrupted. So when, where, and how initiates sleep, eat, socialize, work, even go to the bathroom are all upended. They're all out of their control. They're all changed. And oftentimes in an initiation, knowing the exact time suddenly becomes impossible because we're released from those little bands that we wear around our wrist, or at least that we used to. And so the initiate is often forced to rely on the sun and the stars, the most basic universals of human life, to determine what time it is. So that's an essential component of initiation, is shifting reliance back to what is the most basic essential or essentials in human life. So I hope the parallels between the archetype of initiation and the world that we already find ourselves in are already becoming clear. So just think about it for a minute. Normal work life, it's gone. Normal patterns of shopping, socializing, exercising, entertainment, spiritual, religious practice, it's all gone. And along with that, our sense of safety is also gone to an amazing degree. So the once familiar world is now totally unfamiliar. And I can testify to that too. I'm sure that each of you can as well. But not only have I lost track of the days of the week, back in late August, I lost track of what month it was. I thought it was still late August and we were already 3 or 4 days into September. So we all are experiencing this dramatic severance from the way things used to be. And like it or not, we've all been launched forward into this collective rite of passage that all of the people on the planet, in a sense, are going through simultaneously. So all of this stuff is normal and is actually just as it should be for separation. As painful as it may be for us to be separated from all of these normal patterns of work and socializing, shopping, entertainment, etc., it's absolutely a normal function of initiation, of rite of passage. Now, fortunately, we have some terms too to help us understand some of what's going on. And I like to call back on the Greeks because they had actually 2 words that they used to describe time. One of them is chronos, and the other one was kairos. Now, chronos is that linear sense of time, where 1 second follows another into minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. And all of that very linear sense of time is now, of course, under attack, in a sense. And that's an absolutely traditional hallmark of initiation of rite of passage. we have to shift in some way from that traditional sense of time management to something different. Now, kairos, again, the Greek word kairos, it's spelled K-A-I-R-O-S. It's mystery time, it's subjective time. It's time that sometimes runs in circles. It's the bending of time that occurs in altered states, whether under the influence of psychedelics or communing in a cave with God. It can mean an hour feels like a second, or a week feels like a year. It can mean indeterminate or unknown lengths of time, like the span of a human lifetime, or the time it takes for trees to know when to drop their leaves, or the time that salmon know it's time to return to go up the river and swim upstream, or the time it takes for a star to die and a black hole to be born. So it's cosmic time at one level. So kairos time, shifting from chronos into kairos, is absolutely normal for the second phase of Rite of Passage, which is called ordeal. And in fact, there's a number of other terms that are used synonymously with the term ordeal to speak and address this sense of dislocative time. I can hear an echo here, so I'm going to go ahead and just mute you all, and then I'll put you off mute when I finish. Okay. So one of the synonyms that is commonly used to refer to the second phase of these three phases of Rite of Passage is called liminal, or liminal space. And liminal means that between zone, or if you prefer, the twilight zone. And another term that's often used synonymously is called threshold. And if you think of threshold as in a threshold of a door or entrance to a building, whatever it is, you're sort of between two worlds as you go through that threshold. So let's take a look now at stage 2, ordeal. Now there's some other synonyms that you might recognize from mythology, from religion, and also from literature. And here are some that I particularly like. A journey through the underworld, ending up in the belly of the whale. Obviously, that's from the story of Jonah in the Bible. The dark night of the soul. So all of these terms, I think, I'm just offering them as helpful tools to help this concept of ordeal land a little bit. So I think it's essential that we recognize that, yes, we're doing this collectively. None of us asked for this, but circumstances have forced it upon us. And personally, I feel like, in a sense, it's our collective karma. That, in a sense, the human species on the planet is being not only asked, it's being demanded of us, that we now have to grow up and we have to basically recognize some fundamental truths about human life that we might have been somewhat resistant to acknowledging and naming in the past. Or to put it more simple, you could say now it's time to pay the piper. So for too long, we've lived disconnected from nature and each other. For too long, we've been driven by the ideology of looking out for number one. We've been driven by a shadow. And I don't know how commonly, Chris, you might be using or familiar with the term shadow, but I'll just briefly explain that it's a term from Carl Jung, the student of Sigmund Freud. And basically, it's all of that truth about who we are that we hide, repress, and deny. So it's all of what you might call the dark stuff, the unpleasant stuff, but what is real about who we are as human beings. So so that isolated sense of self, that looking out for number one, is something that is seriously under attack right now. So let me expand a little bit on this idea. But before I do, let me make it clear too about shadow. We all have shadows, all of us. And it can look like greed, it can look like selfishness, it can look like disinterest or apathy, it can take the form of addictions, it can be described as the killer within. Carl Jung was one of the ones who argued that we all, in a sense, have that capacity for killing, and that it's not that capacity that defines and differentiates us as human beings. It's whether we are aware of that capacity within us, and we have that killer shadow, if you will, out in front of us, rather than we're acting unconsciously from that place. So after phase one has basically stripped everything inessential away, all of the accoutrements of daily life, all of the habits, all of the objects, all of our sense of time, the ordeal fundamentally tests everything that we have left, everything that we are as human beings, our morals and our values, our belief systems, our understanding of the meaning of life and death. So even though we didn't choose this rite of passage, we nonetheless have very important choices to make during it. What is it that I need to let go of in order to live most meaningfully? And my hunch is that you, Chris, have probably already been asking yourself that question, because I've been discovering that most people that I'm in conversation with are already doing exactly that as well. Everybody's asking, well, given the chaos, the seeming meaninglessness of this time, who am I? And what is my life about? What am I here to do? So that's a good thing if you're asking yourself that question. Because another way to say that is, what in me needs to die in order for that greater self within to be reborn? So some of the common features of ordeal I've basically already touched on. Kairos time, we enter that mystery time. And just think about, for example, when COVID first appeared, everybody treated it and acted as if, well, this will be maybe a couple months at most, and then it'll be over and we'll move on. Well, no, we are stuck in this Kairos time where we have no idea when this virus is going to end. And it could easily go for another year or more, and it won't necessarily end when and if there's a vaccine that's developed. So anyway, so we're all in Kairos time in a sense. We're all having our fundamentals tested as well. So many people have been thrown out of work, and their essential forms of breadwinning have been stripped away. And suddenly they're really struggling with how to put food on the table for their kids. All of us have, in effect, had our work lives impacted in one way, shape, or form. The most obvious way, of course, is few of us, if any, are driving into work anymore. Most of us are working from home. So another feature of ordeal is to bring us into closer proximity with our shadows, with all of that stuff that we've pushed off the table and tried to pretend is not part of who we are, all of that darkness. And all you have to do is take a close look at the political landscape, and you'll see a lot of shadows being played out right now, to the point where a lot of people are wanting to kill each other, literally. So, those killer shadows have been unleashed to some degree, and they are here, they are present now. And it's interesting too to think about one other fundamental aspect of ordeal, and that is to bring us into closer familiarity with death. One of the things that is a universal for all initiations, we must be brought into close proximity with death. Now, obviously, that's happening too on a planetary scale. We all, if we don't directly know somebody who's died of COVID, we know people who do. We all are fearing for our own well-being, our own health, our own lives. And we're very much made aware of death on a monumental scale every day in the news. How many hundreds of thousands of people have died around the planet, and obviously over 200,000 now in the US alone. So again, in the context of rite of passage, this is actually a good thing, because there's a beauty that happens when we become deeply familiar with death. One, we begin to recognize the preciousness of our own life. We begin to not take it for granted. And that's something that, to me, is a fundamental feature of this planetary rite of passage. People have been shaken out of that sense of sleepiness, lethargy, unawareness. We all know that we're going to die, but we act as if we don't believe it. So it's stripped that away, and we all recognize how fundamentally fragile we are as human beings. And again, this is a good thing. Human life is fragile. So if we awaken to the depth of that fragility, we can also awaken to the splendor and the beauty and the preciousness of this thing called human life. So in a sense, I would kind of sum up what I see as this planetary rite of passage, which is not dissimilar to the rite of passage that adolescents have to go through in stepping through that gateway into young adulthood, into full maturity. We have to die to that sense of me, me, me. It's all about me. I'm looking out for number one. And we have to be reborn into a sense of us, us, us. It's about all of us. It's about the fundamental truth of our interconnection. And I don't think, that it's going to be easy to find anyone these days who would argue against that fundamental truth of our interconnection. Everyone in the world is now, in a sense, fundamentally directly tied back to a livestock market in Wuhan, China. And whatever, a given individual or group of individuals did to begin to release this virus into the human species. And I don't want to get tied down into origination stories. So, it doesn't really matter if, and we don't know for a fact that that's absolutely true, that it started in a livestock market in Wuhan, but however it started, it's tied us all together fundamentally and deeply. And we all at some level understand how my choices affect you and your choices affect me. And it's as simple as whether if you have the virus, you choose to wear a mask or not, that's going to affect everyone around you, obviously. So that makes it very sort of simple in a way to see this fundamental truth of interconnection. But the fact is, it exists at so many different levels and in so many different ways. We can drill down and talk about this ad nauseum, really. But to me, at one level, it's a beautiful illustration of the chaos theory that says, a butterfly's wings in China can create a hurricane in North America. That's almost become literally true in the sense of this virus. But at a kind of a symbolic way, it's absolutely true that all of the actions that each of us undertake, all of the decisions that we make, at some level impact others. And let's take one more just quickly pragmatic example. So let's say that you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts in front of you and you flip them off. Okay, I've been known to do that a few times. We never know because we're out of proximity with it, but what is going to happen as a result of that action that we've taken. And in a sort of a traditional hierarchical scheme, let's just say that if it's a man behind the wheel, then he goes home because he's pissed off. He beats up his wife beat on the kids beat on the dog beats on the cat. I mean, there's always endless ripples of the actions that we take that ripple out into the world that we rarely get to directly experience, but that nonetheless, whether we're aware of them or not, or whether we intend them or not, are happening, are taking shape. So we have to recognize that fundamental truth of our deep interconnection and deduce the logical lesson from that, which is I have to take care of my brothers and sisters as they have to take care of me. And again, this is a fundamental reality of what I would say of maturity, of adulthood. So I've talked a lot now about ordeal. Let me address phase 3 briefly here and then try to bring this to a close. So traditionally, phase 3 is homecoming. And that means returning to the village with a new sense of purpose and belonging. And traditionally, the elders would sit in circle and interpret your ordeal experience. You'd share with them what you've been through. And hopefully you feel somewhat invigorated, renewed, and ready to share the gifts that you've uncovered that are fundamental to who you are as a unique individual. Now, our homecoming as a human species is still a ways off. I think at the very least 1 to 2 more years for COVID. And we don't know right now if there might be other pandemics to follow on the heels of this. But even more to the point, economic depression and political upheaval could last even longer. So I don't think that I need to recount all of the areas of need around the planet right now, or another way of saying that, all of the societal shadows, all that needs changing. But the cracks in the artifice of things as they were are now being all exposed. So, we don't have to look far being in California to understand that drastic environmental change has already hit our time. And, we need to think seriously about eliminating carbon extraction. With fires burning down California, drought is everywhere, etc. Hurricanes in the Gulf and on the Atlantic seaboard at a far greater frequency and far more severe than they've been ever, etc., etc. We also need to begin to think about drastic wealth redistribution, eliminating hunger and poverty. We know that Blacks and Native Americans and Latinos and the poor are dying from COVID at rates that are 2 to 3 times that of others. And if we could simply begin to redistribute some wealth and eliminate some of the hunger and poverty around the world, we wouldn't have 12 people living in a one-room shack, on a reservation in Arizona. So we also need to think about drastic power redistribution, how we can begin to enroll everyone in collective or decision-making, democracy with a small d. Because as you probably well know, Chris, we're on the precipice of fascism. And we don't know what's going to happen in this election. We don't know if the election is going to be severely contested. We don't know if it could lead to civil war. We don't know if we're going to have martial law perhaps imposed on all of us. We don't know if we're going to have right-wing militias show up at polls or try to influence behavior. So we really need to re-democratize how we govern ourselves. So the universe, in a sense, is demanding all of our attention on these issues. It's no accident that it's all sort of happening at the same time. Again, we're being sort of collectively taken by the collar and told, wake up, wake up. So what to do? Well, here's a quote from one of my favorite theologians, Howard Thurman, who was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is for people to come alive. Bucky Fuller, the popularizer of the geodesic dome, he said something very similar. He said, when everyone does what they are most called to do, the world will live in perfect balance. So the logic of Rite of Passage is to make us move beyond our fears into what really calls us, but traditionally we're afraid to act on. And it's interesting because the fear of the unknown, and there's studies that have proven this, is usually greater than the fear of the known. So, for example, there could be a wife at home considering, well, I need to leave my husband because he beats me, but I don't know what's going to happen if I leave him, if I live on my own. That's scary. Same thing, for many people who fear leaving a job. Well, I don't want to leave this job because I don't know what's going to happen on the other side, even if I hate it. So we have to be willing to step into our fears, get acquainted with what we're truly about, again, as unique individual humans. Now, there's various different ways that we can get there. One of the most fundamental is find a mentor. I'm a deep believer in the value of mentorship. And if you don't have a mentor or multiple mentors, reach out now, somebody who you respect, who you think has some wisdom to share, who you say to yourself, I want to be like them. We also have to mentor others so that we actually begin to rebuild chains in not only in community through tiered mentorship, being mentored on one side, but mentoring others, but we also begin to rebuild the broken links of time that have really been fundamentally disrupted for the last couple hundred years due to the industrial age, et cetera. So we also need to underscore our healthy connections. So for all of those that we have deep relationships with and that we most respect, we have to fire up those connections and in effect rebuild them. Personally, I've been on the road now for almost 2 months. And one of the tasks that I've taken for myself is kind of a gratitude tour. So I went to my dying Zen teacher in Wisconsin, and I visited with him, basically just to tell him, look, I want to thank you for mentoring me, for being a colleague, for being a friend. And I want to tell you that you made a difference in my life. So, doing things like that, and also I think connecting in with others helps us understand how we're all coping with this difficult time. And it actually fires up my sense of inspiration, because I'm lucky enough to know a lot of amazing people on this planet. So once a month, starting in April, I've called somebody and I've said, what are you doing? How are you dealing with this time? And invariably, they're doing very creative, original, interesting things. And that also helps remotivate me. It's an important time to maintain strong self-discipline, doing yoga, martial arts, exercise, healthy diet, and to recommit ourselves to what is reinforcing of all of our deepest desires to live a wholesome and healthy life. So in my case, I'm insulin dependent type 1 diabetic, I resolved that I'm going to get off sugar altogether. And frankly, I should have made this decision a long time ago, but better late than never. So that's one of the things that I've been doing. We also have to stand strong for what we know to be right. Because there's, again, so much racial upheaval in the world, racism, economic upheaval. We're on the threshold of a new depression. So we have to stand for the basic rights of all human beings to receive some level of economic and social democracy. It's also a good time to study, learn, and meditate, to go inside or outside, but learn about ourselves and life. One of the things I've undertaken, I did a week-long self-imposed meditation retreat in my own home, getting up at 5 every morning and meditating, alternating walking and sitting meditation, doing a little bit of work, doing exercise, yes, but all day long until about 9 o'clock at night. And it was a great experience for me to remind myself that I don't need my Zen teachers, I don't need my so-called Sangha, my community, to do this. I can do it on my own. So we have to mentor and be mentored. We have to inhabit the healthy sovereign that each of us has as a latent potential within us. We have to understand at a much deeper level what each of us is on this planet to do, what makes us most come alive. And we have to give that and share it with the greatest number of people possible. And we have to ideally model it and not pontificate, which maybe means that everything that I've said is counter to what I'm just telling you. Do as I say, not as I do. No, but it is important really that we model things and we don't lecture people. So anyway, let me stop here. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say. And I'm sure you have some questions or comments.
Well, yeah, listen, I really appreciate you going through this, and it's, you know, I find it really interesting. It's actually pretty familiar in that it's very similar to like Joseph Campbell's work around the hero's journey, which is something that I'm somewhat familiar with. I really am intrigued by the parallels you're drawing between, you know, kind of traditional initiation or a hero's journey and what we're collectively going through. What I don't entirely see, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you know, you and I think probably have very similar, you know, kind of very similar moral compass, very similar worldview. And I'm not as confident that that's shared right now. Like, I'm not sure that the conclusion that the consensus of whether it's the US or the global community or whatever is that this is proving that we're interconnected and we have to work together. That in fact, the evidence seems to be contrary to that right now, where, you know, this is causing, in fact, accelerated disjunction. And, you know, so I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because I don't think that that's a foregone conclusion.
I appreciate that, and I agree with you. And I'm sorry that I made it sound like a foregone conclusion, because it's not. It's very much in question. And we don't know with any guaranteed sense how it's going to turn out. But having said that, I also was assuming that the battery audience that I was going to have tonight would, in effect, be open and sympathetic to the recipe for what is called for. That I see, that this collective shift in our common human behavior that's really required for us to grow up. But you're right, there's a lot of people who are kicking and screaming and in effect saying, I don't want to grow up. I don't want this.
Yeah, well, and I think that, you know, where the analogy kind of breaks down a little bit for me is, you know, this idea of return, you know, on an individual rite of passage, you're coming back to a community, which may be changing, and your role in it may be changing. And the whole idea is you're now an adult and you're going to be contributing to something that's evolving. But the, you know, I think that the global framework right now is not near as clear, right, as, you know, a typical, you know, narrative of what you would see with a rite of passage, where, you know, you have components that that are going through a rite of passage within a greater context. I think part of the problem right now is getting a handle on what is that greater context, right? Because as you say, we're all going through this rite of passage, right? So, and we're not going back to anything. One of the things that I find most frustrating about politics right now is, the debate seems to be whether we want to go back to the 70s or the 50s, right? But we're not going back to anything, right? So the question is, where are we going, right?
Correct. Yeah, no, I agree with you totally. Yeah, so, well, it's not an easy thing, to have the planet suddenly everyone awaken and grow up. The point is that the opportunity is here. That's really the basic point. Yeah. And I think that there will be, well, and in fact, all of the indications are we've been regressing. That most of just if you look at governments around the planet over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a rightward shift throughout the entire planet. And that actually is, I think, understandable, given that the pace of change has so accelerated, and people are terrified. People are so afraid of that pace of change, and their increasing lack of familiarity and education and awareness of what these changes mean. So that's part of it. But anyway, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Chris.
Yeah, and I guess, one of the things that I've been struggling with is, kind of what needs to be the new narrative of where we're going? Like, what is the story that we're telling ourselves, right? Because, part of the problem that I see is that the stories that we have don't work for us anymore, right? That, whether they're the stories of our cultural stories or, as we're seeing right now, for instance, our cultural stories, we're finding are, for the most part, not inclusive enough, right? That, if you look at kind of the core of what we've told ourselves about, in terms of us being Americans, or frankly, take any other, right, culture, right? That one of the things we're finding is that, given the dynamics of the, of everything that's going on, right, that those stories aren't sufficient. We need to evolve them.
Yes.
Right. And so, I guess it's just an observation. I mean, this is what I'm struggling with is, okay, where are those new narratives? What are the, you're a storyteller, right? So, how do we begin to tell a story that can draw us together, that can be aspirational, that can bring out the good in us, that can get us beyond the fear, right?
Yeah, well, and the stories that I tell are ones about transformation, but showing human transformation, individual transformation. And so I am reminded of that Howard Thurman quote, which is contrary to some of what I did in my talk, but to let go of what that greater narrative is, and to focus on ourselves, and to ask ourselves, am I living my deepest fulfillment? Am I living my deepest potential? Because one thing we know we can change, and that is ourselves. We have little to no guarantee of impact in anything outside of ourselves. So forgive me, but I'm curious to ask you, I mean, so what have you resolved for yourself in the way of life changes, shifts that you want to make for your own well-being?
Wow, that's a big question. That's something I'm thinking about right now. I'm not sure I can, articulate it. One, I mean, certainly being in San Francisco, being in the Silicon Valley, being in California, being in America, right? I mean, much of what we do will influence everything around the globe. And how we respond to this, and there are very, very different scenarios. I mean, to some extent, we're kind of living Schrodinger's cat. We don't know what's going to happen, a week from next Tuesday, and we're not quite sure, how some of these things might get drawn out or get prolonged or become additional challenges. as you mentioned, I mean, we could be going through a period of civil unrest where we have to get through that before we could do anything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very challenging time just to gain perspective, right? Because really, much of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, much of what we're reading, and what's going on the other channel right now around the debate, right, is irrelevant to what the world will be in 4 years or 10 years, or
Yeah.
we're stuck in these small skirmishes or kind of local conflicts that in the broader scheme of things don't really matter.
Yes.
Right. Yet at the same time, if we enter a time of severe tyranny or extended civil unrest, then that they could matter a lot, right? So it's just kind of hard to gain perspective on this right now.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And again, forgive me, and just feel free to just say, no, I'd rather not go there. But I'm curious. I mean, have there been any challenges you've put to yourself? Like, well, I'm going to exercise a little more, or I'm going to read a little more, or I'm maybe thinking about a new direction for my career and my work life, or anything like that for you?
Well, I guess I would say all of the above without going into a lot of detail, but yeah, I am in a career transition right now. I'm doing yoga at home for the first time because I can't go to the gym. I mean, all of those things are are happening. And it's a struggle because the other thing is, as you pointed out before, I mean, everything is in turmoil and chaos, right? I mean, even going, like I'm going to go see my folks this weekend, but even that is a chore to make sure that I feel like I'm safe enough, that I've been, isolated enough that I'm not going to put them at risk, that we're, all of that is, I don't know, it's a very challenging time.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've observed about my own life, I'm lucky enough that, I can do art on a full-time basis. Basically, I can tell stories through my films, and my books and blogs, etc. But I've also learned over the years that I can use my own life as clay to sculpt something of artistic value. And so I've been semi-conscious. I'm much more conscious of it now that it's October than I was in March when I first did it. But I had an instinctive sense that fear was sort of collapsing everyone's horizons to the point where that it might not have been rational, and that it might not have been healthy. So one of the things that I've taken to doing, which is completely counterintuitive, is traveling. And as I said earlier, I've been on the road in this trip with my girlfriend for 2 months now, and we took the car across country. We visited her family in Massachusetts, and as I said, I've been meeting other teachers and influencers who I most respect, but also continuing my work. And it's partly just simply to posit with my life an example of there are other ways of doing this. Obviously, we take precautions, and I'm not throwing caution to the wind, and we get tested regularly. In fact, we just had our second test yesterday, and I'm waiting for the results still, but we've been negative all the times prior. And so anyway, it is possible to do other than what dictates the norm, that the norm dictates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I appreciate, and I apologize if I've been too directed toward you.
No,
but
not at all. I really appreciate the discussion, and I'm glad, we were able to have you, and I'm sorry that we didn't, there's not a bigger audience for this, but people will see the recording, and, I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I enjoy it. And that's the way I work too, is that I like getting personal with everyone who I interact with. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll sign off unless Maggie, you have a question or a comment.
I do not. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great to see you.
Nice to meet you, Chris.
Nice meeting you. Thank you very much, Frederick. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Be well. Be safe.
You too. Take care.
Bye now.